And nothing exposes the heart problem we have than to watch America now trying to have this dialogue about racism and classism. My God, it exposes a serious, normally, Dr. Forbes, like you, I normally wouldn't be this long, but let me work in here for a minute. We do need to have a transformative conversation and a transformative movement about racism and classism. But we got a heart problem when somebody thinks that you can have a conversation about racism and you begin by trying to blame Obama and Clinton for all the racial disparities in this culture. Now, nobody is totally clean because race has so infested and been a part of the American psyche. But how can you try to blame Obama and Clinton for the racial disparities and not say anything about the Southern strategy that began in the 1960s, and Dr. King was killed, and Malcolm was killed, and Medgar Evers was killed, and Kevin Phillips was tutoring George Wallace and Richard Nixon, and he said, I know how we can win. You find out who hates who, and you pit them against each other. And the Southern strategy was about writing a new thesaurus for racism. You no longer say the N-word, but you use coded language, according to Lee Atwater, like tax cuts and law and order and entitlement reform. How can you want to talk about race and not talk about this 50-year history of obstructionism and attempts to roll back every gain of the civil rights? How can you talk about racism and not talk about how Strom Thurmond led the Dixiecrats into the Republican Party, and how Kevin Phillips told Richard Nixon, if we do this thing right, we can make the Democratic Party the party of black folk and the Republican Party the party of white people in the South, and we can get whites to vote against their own self-interest. You can't talk about the complications of racism by trying to just blame it. How can you talk about racism and not talk about how Nixon, Reagan, and Bush used the Southern strategy? How they stood against the Voting Rights Continuing and the Civil Rights Act, how they were obstructions to every progressive idea, low living wages, health care for all, which is actually a Republican idea. It came from Teddy Roosevelt. And yet you have extremists who claim a legacy to Teddy Roosevelt, but they don't follow the path. How? We got a heart problem. How can you talk about racism and classism and bypass the Great Recession under George Bush that had a tremendous negative impact on Latinos and black people and poor white people? How can you talk about racism and about that you're going to help black people talking to all white audiences? I'm just raising a question. I ain't trying to tell y'all who to vote for. I'm just talking about what they're talking about. I'm just talking about what they're talking about. How can you begin a conversation about racism and you stand up and you basically say that African Americans are a problem people, not just people with problems, that they, all that poverty in their community and killing in their community, as though other folk don't have poverty and other folk are not dying? See, the question when it comes to having a conversation is not you claiming that you're the party of Abraham Lincoln. He dead. We want to know what you're doing now and what you've been doing for the last 50 years. Where have you been? Which side are you on? Have you been on the side of living wages? Have you been on the side of voting rights? Have you been on the side of health care? Have you been on the side of anti-discrimination? Have you been on the side of immigrant rights? Have you been on the side of treating everybody right? If you haven't been on those sides, you can't be a Johnny-come-lately and offer to solve all our problems. That's a hard problem. And then we surely got a hard problem when you think you can stand up and suggest that we're gullible and don't know how to vote. Black folk have had to be the most sophisticated voters in America. And black women have had to be the sure enough most sophisticated voters, and black women vote at a higher rate than any other ethnic group. And I know you don't think you're gonna get a hearing in the black community by calling black women dumb. We're gullible, been giving away our votes.